Violet Slater saw the man's knife flash against the timber, a heartbeat before the dam groaned like a dying animal, and she was already screaming a warning before she understood what she had seen. The heat had not broken in 11 days. Copper Creek ran thin and brown between its banks, and the log crib dam that fed both the town's irrigation ditches and the stock ponds beyond had been straining under a summer so dry that grown men wept over dead cattle. Violet had ridden 2 days from the rail stop at Bitter Bend, with a satchel of quinine, carbolic acid, and surgical instruments strapped behind her saddle, and a letter folded into the lining of her coat addressed to a doctor. Absalom Reed, physician, Larkspur Hollow, Wyoming Territory. She had not expected to arrive in time to watch a man try to murder a town. He was crouched low against the dam's downstream face, half hidden by the spillway's shadow, sawing at a load-bearing timber with quick, practice strokes. Violet had grown up watching her father set broken bones by lantern light, and had learned early that hesitation killed more patience than ignorance ever did. She swung down from her mare before the animal had fully stopped, snatched a fence rail from the nearby corral, and ran toward the dam shouting at the top of her lungs. "Stop! That timber is going to give." The man at the dam turned, saw her, and made his decision in the space of a breath. He dropped the knife and ran. Violet did not chase him. She had already seen the cracks spreading white and jagged through the wood, heard the low complaint of the whole structure shifting, and she understood, with the particular clarity that comes only in true emergencies, that there was no time left to catch a criminal. There was only time to save whoever stood downstream. That was when the mountain man came out of the trees. He came at a dead run down the slope above the spillway, and even in her terror Violet's mind registered him the way it registered any significant physical fact. Enormous, quick despite his size, a man built through years of hard use rather than idle strength, dark hair grown past his collar and tied back with a leather cord, a buckskin coat despite the heat, forearms corded with muscle as he seized 2 children who had been fishing from the bank and threw them bodily up onto the higher ground as though they weighed nothing at all. "Get back from the water!" He roared, and his voice cut through the growing thunder of the failing dam, with the authority of a man used to being obeyed in far worse moments than this one. The timber gave entirely a second later. Copper Creek, 12 days pent up and furious, exploded through the breach in a brown wall that took out fence posts and a tool shed, and very nearly took a young girl who had frozen in place at the water's edge, too frightened to run. Violet saw her, saw the water coming, and moved without deciding to move, throwing herself forward and grabbing the child around the waist. The current caught them both, and Violet felt her boots lose the ground. A hand closed around her wrist like an iron manacle. "I have you," the mountain man said, and hauled them both out of the flood with one arm as though he were lifting sacks of grain, setting them down hard on dry ground and dropping to one knee beside the coughing, sobbing child to check her over with hands far gentler than his size suggested they could be. Violet, soaked through and shaking, found her voice first. "She's breathing. She swallowed water, but her lungs are clear. Listen." She pressed her ear briefly to the girl's chest out of long habit, then looked up into the stranger's face for the first time. He had eyes the color of creek water in shadow, gray-green and very still, and he was looking at her with an expression she could not immediately name. Assessment, she realized. He was doing to her exactly what she had just done to the child, cataloging whether she was hurt, whether she was steady, whether she could be relied upon. "You are a doctor," he said. It was not a question. "Violet Slater," she said, because names seemed suddenly important given what they had just survived together. "Yes, a doctor." "Jedediah Morgan." He rose to his feet in one smooth motion, and standing, he was taller than she had first appreciated, taller than any man she had treated in her 4 years of practice, with the kind of shoulders that made a person understand, instinctively, why cavalry scouts and mountain trappers survived when other men did not. "There is a man running for the tree line east of here who just tried to drown this town. Somebody ought to go after him, and somebody ought to look after the wounded." I expect you're better suited to the second." "And you to the first," Violet said, already turning toward the row of townsfolk stumbling out of ruined buildings, already reaching for the satchel she'd flung clear of the water before the current took her. Jedediah Morgan was gone into the trees before she finished the sentence, moving with a silence that seemed impossible for a man his size. The flood had not killed anyone, though it came near enough to several that Violet spent the next 3 hours with her sleeves rolled to the elbow, setting a broken forearm, stitching a gash on an old rancher's scalp, and forcing water and willowbark tea into 3 children gone gray with shock. It was well past dark before she had a moment to breathe, sitting on the steps of what had once been the dry goods store, and it was there that the town's mayor, a heavy-set man named Otto Rourke, found her and asked, not unkindly, what business had brought a lady doctor to Larkspur Hollow in the first place. Violet drew the letter from her coat, still damp at the edges, and held it out. "I came to see Dr. Absalom Reed. I have a letter of introduction from my mentor in Cheyenne, Dr. Josiah Hale. He and Dr. Reed trained together 20 years ago. I was told Dr. Reed needed a partner in his practice." Rourke's face did something complicated, sorrow and apology moving through it in quick succession. "Miss Slater, I am sorry to tell you. Absalom Reed died of typhoid fever 2 months back. We buried him up on the rise above the church. We have had no doctor in this town since." Violet looked down at the letter in her hand, at Dr. Reed's name written in Josiah Hale's careful copperplate, addressed to a man who had been in the ground since May, and felt something in her chest settle into a strange, quiet grief for a stranger she had never met and now never would. "Then I suppose," she said slowly, "that I have arrived exactly when you needed me, even if not for the reason I intended." Rourke looked at her with new interest. "You would consider staying, after tonight?" Violet looked out at the ruined dam, at the water still running wild and wasted down the wrong channel, at the exhausted, frightened faces of people who had nearly lost everything to a stranger's knife, and thought of the 2 days of hard riding behind her, the years of study before that, her father's death that had set her on this road in the first place. "I did not ride 200 miles to turn back at the first trouble," she said. "Yes, Mr. Rourke, I will stay." By the time Jedediah Morgan returned from the tree line, the saboteur had vanished into country he clearly knew better than any pursuer, and Jedediah came back with nothing but a boot print, a length of rope cut clean with a folding knife, and a temper banked low and dangerous behind his still gray eyes. He found Violet at the ruined dam site in the gray hour before dawn, kneeling by the broken timber with a lantern, examining the cut wood with the same careful attention she had given the injured. "You should be asleep," he said. "So should you." She did not look up. "This cut was made with a fine-toothed saw, not an axe, and not a knife despite what it looks like at a glance. Whoever did this came prepared and came more than once, I think. Look here." She held the lantern closer to a second timber, weathered but with a scar half-healed beneath the surface. This support was weakened weeks ago and left to finish failing on its own. Someone wanted this to look like age and drought, not sabotage. Jedediah crouched beside her, and up close she could see the marks of a hard life on him plainly. A scar through one eyebrow, the leathered brown of skin that had spent decades under open sky, hands scarred across the knuckles in the particular pattern of a man who had used them as weapons more than once. And yet he examined the wood with the same patient exactness she had just applied, turning it in the lantern light, running a thumb along the old cut. "You have a scout's eye," he said. "I have a surgeon's eye. It amounts to the same discipline, I think. You look at what is actually there instead of what you expect to find." He looked at her then, not at the wood. "Most people who arrive in a town and watch it half wash away leave on the next stage east." "Most people," Violet said, "have not spent 4 years watching men die of things that could have been prevented if somebody had simply looked closely enough, soon enough. I am not in the habit of running from a problem I might be useful against." Something shifted in his face, some grudging respect settling into place beside the wariness. There is talk already starting in town that the Shoshone band up past the forks did this. Somebody is going to want to believe that story because it is easier than believing a white man cut the dam on purpose. Do you believe that story? I scouted 11 years for the Army, Miss Slater. I have seen more treaties broken by ink than by arrows. No, he shook his head slowly. This was a saw and a plan, not a raid. Whoever cut this dam wanted somebody else blamed for it. Violet studied him in the lantern light. This enormous, quiet man who had run into a flood without a second's hesitation, and now spoke of broken treaties with the weary precision of a man who had personally witnessed too many of them. "Then we had better find out who," she said, "before the wrong people pay for another man's crime." He held her gaze a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and Violet felt the same current that had nearly swept her downstream earlier pulling at her again, a different kind of danger entirely. "We," he repeated, as if testing the word. "I intend to stay in Larkspur Hollow, Mr. Morgan. That makes this my trouble now as much as yours." He rose, offering her a hand up that she did not strictly need but took anyway, and his grip swallowed hers entirely, warm and careful, a strength that had just proven it could tear a man free of drowning currents now handling her fingers as though they were made of glass. "Then I suppose," he said, "we had better find that saboteur before he tries again." The days that followed the flood were the hardest kind of busy, the kind that left no hour for reflection. Violet claimed Dr. Reed's old office above the Mercantile, a single room that still smelled faintly of the carbolic acid and dried herbs of its previous occupant, and within a week she had treated sunstroke, a difficult breech birth, an infected dog bite, and no fewer than 4 cases of the low fever that came, she suspected, from drinking creek water gone stagnant behind the ruined dam. The heat did not break. Wells dropped low enough that ranchers hauled water in barrels from what remained of the creek, and tempers frayed along with the grass. It was in this climate of thirst and suspicion that the story of Shoshone raiders cutting the dam took hold, spreading through Larkspur Hollow like the fever Violet was fighting in her little office. She heard it first from a rancher's wife who came in for a headache powder, and stayed to tell Violet, in a lowered and confiding voice, that the band camped up past the forks under a chief named Samach had been seen near the dam the week before the flood, and that surely this proved what everyone had suspected since the spring, that the water rights agreement signed 3 years back had never been anything but a temporary peace. Violet had learned enough in her short time in town to know the shape of that agreement. Copper Creek's water was to be shared between Larkspur Hollow settlers and Chief Samach's band according to a treaty, negotiated with the help of an interpreter named Otis Prout, a wiry, quick-tongued man who worked as land agent for a cattle syndicate out of Cheyenne, and who had, by his own frequent telling, been essential to keeping the peace in the valley. Violet had met him twice already, both times finding his smile a fraction too wide, and his eyes a fraction too calculating for a man who claimed to want nothing but goodwill between settlers and the band whose land bordered the creek. She mentioned this to Jedediah on the 6th evening after the flood, when he arrived at her office door with a haunch of venison, and more usefully, a bundle of dried yarrow he had gathered from the high meadows, knowing from something she'd said in passing that she used it for wound dressing. "You did not need to bring anything," she said, though she was glad of the yarrow and gladder still, if she was honest with herself, of the sight of him filling her doorway, buckskin dusted with trail dirt, his dark hair loose around his shoulders after a day without the leather cord. "A man doesn't ride down from the mountains for nothing, Miss Slater." He set the venison on her table with the careless ease of a man used to providing for others without ceremony. "I came to tell you Prout was at the trading post today, telling anyone who'd listen that Samach's people cut the dam to punish the town for taking more water than the treaty allows." "Is that true, that the town has been taking more water?" "No more than usual, and less than usual this summer besides, on account of the drought hitting everyone the same. But that is not the interesting part. Jedediah lowered himself into the single spare chair, which groaned faintly under a frame, more accustomed to standing than sitting. I served 11 years as an army scout, most of it in country not far from here, and I learned Shoshone dialect well enough to get by without needing another man's translation. I asked Prout today, plain as anything, to repeat back to me exactly what line of the treaty he claims the band violated. And he could not do it, not the actual words. He gave me a paraphrase that did not match anything I remember from when that agreement was read aloud at the signing 3 years back. I was there, Miss Slater. I scouted for the officer who oversaw it. Prout was the only man in that room who spoke both languages well enough to translate for Chief Samach, which meant Samach had to trust that what was read to him in his own tongue matched what was written down in English. If Prout lied then, or is lying now, there is nobody left to catch him at it except a man who happens to also speak both languages. Violet felt the shape of the danger settle into place, cold despite the summer heat still pressing against the window glass. You think Prout has been misrepresenting the treaty terms to both sides, telling the settlers the band has broken faith, and perhaps telling the band the same of the settlers. I think somebody wants this valley emptied of both the band and half the ranchers currently working it, and a cattle syndicate willing to buy up cheap, frightened land afterward. I think Prout is being paid to make that happen with nothing but words, because words are cheaper and quieter than guns, right up until they aren't. And the dam, Jedediah's jaw tightened. A cut dam blamed on the band gives the ranchers reason to ride against Samach's people. That is not sabotage of water, Miss Slater. That is sabotage of peace. Violet sat down slowly across from him, the yarrow bundle still in her hands, and found herself studying his face the way she had studied it in the lantern light by the broken timber, looking past the scars and the sun-weathered skin to the quiet, careful intelligence working behind his eyes. You left the cavalry. Why? Something closed over his expression, brief and total, like a door shutting. I translated for 11 years, Miss Slater, and I watched good words turned into bad orders more times than I care to count. I was at the Washita in '68, though I was young and green then, and I have spent every year since trying to be a man who does not need to translate anyone's suffering into someone else's advantage ever again. He looked at his hands, scarred and enormous on the table between them. I came up into these mountains to be done with all of it. I did not intend to find myself in the middle of the same old poison, just wearing a different coat. But you have found yourself in the middle of it. Because of you in part, he said, and the corner of his mouth moved in something that was almost, but not quite, a smile. You are a difficult woman to leave to trouble alone, Violet Slater. She felt the warmth of that more than she should have, given how briefly they had known each other, and chose to answer with practicality rather than admit it. Then we had better gather proof, before Prout's lies get someone killed. It was 3 weeks later, in the last brutal grip of the heat wave, that the practical question of Violet's situation in Larkspur Hollow came to a head. She had been treating patients in Jedediah's company more often than not by then, since his knowledge of both languages and terrain made him useful in ways the town had quickly come to rely upon, and the two of them had fallen into an easy rhythm of shared purpose that neither acknowledged in words as anything more than necessity. But necessity, in a town as small and watchful as Larkspur Hollow, had its own reputation to answer for. They are saying things about you, Jedediah told her one evening, standing in the doorway of her office rather than entering it, which told her plainly enough how seriously he took the matter. An unmarried woman doctor working alone, receiving a mountain man at all hours. Rourke has had complaints. There is talk of the council revoking their support for your practice on account of propriety, regardless of how many lives you have saved. Violet felt anger rise hot and immediate. I have delivered 3 children and set more bones than I can count in 6 weeks. My competence is not in question. No. Your reputation is, which in a town like this amounts to the same thing, unfair as that may be. He rubbed a hand across his jaw, and for the first time since she had known him, he looked uncertain, a big man wrestling with a problem too delicate for brute strength to solve. "I have thought of a solution, though I expect you may not care for it. Say it plainly, Mr. Morgan. I have little patience left for delicacy in this heat. Marry me." The words landed in the small room with the weight of a dropped stone. Violet stared at him, waiting for some further explanation, some softening, and when none came she found her voice, careful and level despite the sudden pounding of her heart. "That is a practical suggestion, I think, and not a romantic one." "It is practical," he agreed, without apology. "A married woman doctor answers every objection the council could raise, and I will admit there is some benefit to me as well. I have no family left living, and a man alone in these mountains grows careless about certain things a wife would see to. It would be a fair arrangement, Violet, respect and partnership, and I would never lay a claim on you that you did not wish to grant." Violet looked at him for a long moment, at the honest, unadorned offer in his gray-green eyes, and felt something in her chest ache with a complicated grief, because some smaller, quieter part of her wanted very badly to say yes, and that very wanting was exactly why she could not. "No," she said softly. "Thank you, Jedediah, I mean that. But I did not ride 200 miles and bury my mentor's letter with a dead man's name on it to build a new life on convenience. If I ever marry, I want it to be because a man loves me, not because I am a problem in need of solving. And I think," she added more gently, "that you deserve the same, though I do not think you have let yourself believe it in a very long time." Jedediah absorbed this without visible offense, though something in his shoulders settled as though a weight he had expected to carry had been, unexpectedly, set down. "You are not wrong," he admitted. "I offered out of duty, not desire. I think I knew you would refuse it before I finished asking." "Then why ask?" "Because a man ought to try to protect what matters to him, even clumsily." He held her gaze, and there was nothing clumsy in that look at all. "I will find another way to shield your name from Rourke's counsel, Violet Slater. But I will not pretend I offered marriage only out of duty, when I stand here and find I would rather have earned it honestly instead." He left before she could answer, and Violet sat alone in the gathering dark of her little office for a long time afterward, her pulse still unsteady, wondering when exactly this careful, dangerous man had become someone she could not imagine her new life in Larkspur Hollow without. The refused proposal did not end the gossip, as Jedediah had feared it would not, and matters worsened rapidly when Silas Crane arrived in town. He came representing the same Cheyenne cattle syndicate that had, Violet later learned, purchased grazing rights across half the valley over the past 2 years, and he wore his charm like a well-tailored coat, smooth and expensive, and designed to be admired rather than trusted. He made a great show of concern for the towns suffering under the drought, offered fair prices for struggling ranchers' herds, and spoke often and sympathetically of the danger posed by Chief Samach's band, always careful to frame his sympathy as reluctant rather than eager. It was Crane who first suggested publicly, at a tense town meeting held in the half-repaired church, that Jedediah Morgan's fluency in Shoshone dialect made him a man of divided loyalties. "I mean no insult to Mr. Morgan," Crane said, in a tone that promised precisely the opposite, "but a man who spends as much time as he does in company with Samach's people, who speaks their tongue like a native son, ought perhaps to explain where his true sympathies lie, now that this valley faces a choice between its own safety and theirs." Violet, sitting near the back of the church, felt her temper flare hot and immediate, and she rose before she had fully decided to speak. "Mr. Morgan's fluency," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the packed room, "is the only reason any of us know that Otis Prout has been lying about the treaty terms to both sides for his own profit. If anyone here has divided loyalties, Mr. Crane, I would look first at the men whose employer stands to gain a valley's worth of cheap land should this town and the band destroy each other over a lie." The silence that followed was total and dangerous, and Violet watched Crane's polished smile falter for just a moment before he recovered it. "That is a serious accusation, Dr. Slater," he said softly. "I hope you have proof to match it, before you damage a man's reputation so publicly." "I intend to have proof," Violet said, "very soon." She did not, in fact, have proof yet, and she was uncomfortably aware, walking home from the meeting in the hot dark with her heart still racing, that she had just made herself and Jedediah both targets of a much more dangerous kind of retaliation than gossip. Jedediah found her at the edge of town, having apparently followed at a discreet distance to see her safely home, a habit she had noticed and not objected to in recent weeks. "You did not need to defend me at the cost of your own standing," he said, though there was something in his voice that undercut the mild reproach, something closer to wonder. "I defended the truth," Violet said. "You happened to be standing beside it." He laughed then, a short, surprised sound she had not heard from him before, low and warm, and it did something to her chest that she chose, for the moment, not to examine too closely. "You are the most contrary woman I have ever met, Violet Slater. I have been told that before, usually by men who wished I would agree with them instead." "I do not wish that at all," Jedediah said, quietly serious now. "I think I have spent 11 years around men who only ever told me what I wanted to hear, right up until it got somebody killed. I find I would rather have your contrary honesty than any amount of easy agreement." They walked the rest of the way to her office in a silence that felt, for the first time, entirely comfortable rather than merely necessary, and when they reached her door Jedediah paused, looking down at her with an expression she was beginning to recognize as the particular quiet he wore when he was choosing his words with great care. "I meant what I said the night I proposed," he said, "that I would rather earn something honestly than take it out of duty. I do not know yet what that means for us, Violet. But I did not want you thinking I had stopped wanting to try, simply because you were wise enough to refuse the wrong reason for it." Violet felt her breath catch and found, when she answered, that her voice was not quite steady. "I have not stopped thinking about it either, Jedediah." It was not a declaration, not yet, but it was enough for both of them to carry home that night, warm and unresolved, like a coal banked carefully to keep through until morning. The proof they needed came, unexpectedly, from a wounded man Violet treated 10 days later. He was Shoshone, perhaps 30 years old, brought to her office in the middle of the night by 2 frightened young men who explained, in halting English mixed with gestures, that he had been shot in a confrontation with ranchers who believed, on Prute's telling, that the band intended to raid the settlement's remaining cattle in retaliation for the dam. Violet worked for 3 hours by lamplight to remove the bullet lodged near his collarbone, with Jedediah standing by to translate, and to hold the man steady when the pain grew unbearable, his enormous hands gentle and sure on a stranger's shoulders in a way that told Violet everything she needed to know about the true nature of his strength. When the wounded man, whose name was Ahiga, was stable enough to speak, he told them through Jedediah's careful translation a story that confirmed every suspicion they had gathered. Prute had come to Chief Samach's camp months before, claiming the settlement demanded exclusive rights to Copper Creek's water for the remainder of the drought, a demand that violated the original treaty entirely. Samach, trusting the interpreter who had negotiated the original peace, had sent Ahiga and others to observe the dam, intending only to monitor whether the settlement kept its word, never to sabotage anything. "He says," Jedediah translated slowly, his voice tight with restrained anger, "that Prute showed the chief a paper with an official seal, claiming it was a new order from the territorial governor. Samach cannot read English. He had to trust Prute's word for what the paper said." "Did Ahiga see this paper?" Violet asked. "Would he know it again?" Jedediah asked, and Ahiga nodded, wincing at the movement, and answered at length. "He says it had a red wax seal, and that Prute kept it folded inside his coat, close, like a man protecting something valuable. He believes Prout still carries such papers when he visits the syndicate office in town. Violet looked at Jedediah across the lamplit room, both of them understanding at once what needed to happen next. "We need that paper," she said. "Then we will need to be very careful how we get it," Jedediah answered. "Crane already suspects us both of working against him. If we are caught searching Prout's office, we will hand him exactly the excuse he needs to ruin us." It was, in the end, Violet's medical authority that provided their opening. 3 days later, when Prout himself came to her office complaining of a troublesome tooth that had kept him awake for a week, Violet treated the abscess with the same careful professionalism she gave any patient, and while he sat groggy and grateful under the effects of the laudanum, she administered for the extraction. Jedediah, waiting outside under the pretense of delivering firewood, slipped into the syndicate office 2 doors down and found. Inside a locked drawer he opened with the quiet efficiency of a man who had once needed such skills to survive, a folder of correspondence between Prout and Silas Crane that made their intentions plain beyond any doubt. The letters spoke openly of manipulating both the settlement council and Chief Samach's band toward conflict, of a syndicate contract already drawn up to purchase abandoned or forfeited land at a fraction of its worth, and of a bonus payment promised to Prout should hostilities break out before the end of the year. There was no forged government seal among the papers, but there was something nearly as damning: a rough draft, in Prout's own hand, of the false treaty terms he had been feeding to Samach, with the real, original treaty language crossed through and replaced. Jedediah returned to Violet's office just as she was seeing Prout out, groggy but unaware of anything amiss, and once the door closed behind the departing interpreter, he laid the folder on Violet's table with grim satisfaction. "We have him," he said. "We have Prout," Violet corrected. "Crane will not fall so easily. A man like that will have made certain his own name appears nowhere he cannot deny." She was right, though neither of them yet understood how quickly and viciously Crane would move once he learned, within a day, that his office had been searched. The blow fell 3 mornings later. Violet arrived at her office to find the town council waiting for her, along with Rourke, wearing an expression of grave discomfort, and Silas Crane standing at the back of the room with the calm satisfaction of a man who has already won. "Dr. Slater," Rourke began heavily, "a serious accusation has been brought before the council. Mr. Crane reports that his office was broken into 3 nights past, and papers of a sensitive business nature were taken. He believes Jedediah Morgan is responsible, and given your close association with Mr. Morgan, some members of this council question whether you were complicit." "I was not complicit in a break-in," Violet said carefully, "because there was no crime committed against an innocent man. Mr. Crane's papers, if they were examined, would reveal a conspiracy between himself and Otis Prout to falsify treaty terms and provoke violence against Chief Samach's people for the syndicate's financial gain." A murmur ran through the room, uncertain, and Crane spread his hands with wounded innocence. "A remarkable accusation, Doctor, and a convenient one, given that Mr. Morgan cannot produce whatever papers he supposedly took, since I reported them missing entirely. Perhaps they exist only in his imagination and yours." Violet's stomach dropped. She turned to find Jedediah already present near the door, his face carved from stone, and understood in an instant what had happened. Crane had gotten to the folder first, or destroyed it, or hidden it beyond reach before they could produce it as evidence. Without the letters, they had only Ahaga's testimony, spoken through a translator the council had just been primed to distrust, against the word of a respected syndicate agent. "Where is the folder?" she asked Jedediah quietly, his jaw tightened. "Gone. Someone searched my cabin 2 nights past while I was in town. I thought it merely thieves after supplies." Rourke looked between them, clearly unhappy with the position he had been placed in. "Without proof, I cannot in good conscience take Mr. Morgan's word over Mr. Crane's, not on a matter this serious. Mr. Morgan, I must ask you to keep your distance from town business until this is settled. Dr. Slater, your practice may continue, but I would advise you, for your own reputation's sake, to distance yourself from this dispute entirely." "I will not abandon the truth for the sake of my reputation," Violet said sharply, but she saw already that the room had turned, that Crane's calm performance had done its work, and that Jedediah, standing silent and furious near the door, had just been effectively exiled from the very town he had spent weeks trying to protect. He left without another word, and Violet, torn between fury and grief, found she could not immediately follow without making both their positions worse. It was the closest thing to defeat she had felt since her father's death, and it sat bitter and heavy in her chest for the rest of that long, hot day. For 3 weeks afterward, Jedediah Morgan did not come to town, and Violet did not go to him, both of them respecting, however painfully, the practical necessity of letting the storm of suspicion die down rather than feeding it further. She heard of him only second-hand, through Ahijah, who came twice more for the change of his dressing, and reported, in his improving English, that the mountain man had returned to his cabin high above the tree line and spoke to almost no one. She missed him with an intensity that startled her, missed the particular quality of his silences, the careful gentleness he showed patience despite his size, the dry humor that surfaced rarely but always at exactly the right moment. She told herself this was simply the loneliness of a woman new to a hostile town, and did not entirely believe it. The heat wave broke at last in early September with 3 days of hard, blessed rain that filled the wells and greened the parched grass, but it was replaced, as autumn deepened into the first bitter cold of the high country, by a different kind of danger entirely, one that would force Violet and Jedediah back together whether the town approved or not. The outbreak began in Chief Samach's camp in late November, when a child fell ill with a fever and a raw, choking throat that Ahijah, arriving breathless at Violet's office after a hard ride, described with enough clinical detail that Violet's blood ran cold even before he finished speaking. "Diphtheria," she said. "It matches diphtheria exactly. How many are sick?" "6 children when I left, perhaps more by now." Violet was already moving, pulling her satchel from its shelf, checking her small store of antitoxin serum, a hard-won and precious supply she had carried west and rationed carefully ever since, knowing how rare and valuable it was this far from any city hospital. She had perhaps enough for a dozen patients if she was careful, and diphtheria, left untreated, killed children with terrible speed by suffocation. "How far is the camp?" 2 days' ride in good weather. The pass above the forks is the only way through this time of year, and snow has already closed the lower trail. Violet looked out her window at the sky, gray and heavy with the particular stillness that, in her limited experience of Wyoming winters, she had already learned to associate with an approaching storm, and felt fear settle into her stomach alongside her resolve. "I need a guide who knows that pass well enough to find it blind," she said. Ahijah's expression answered before he spoke. "There is only one man in this valley who knows it that well and might still be willing to go." Violet found Jedediah's cabin an hour's hard ride above the tree line, smoke curling from its chimney into the darkening sky, and when he opened the door to her knock, his surprise gave way almost instantly to a focused, quiet alarm that told her he had already guessed, from the urgency in her face, that something serious had brought her to his door. "Children are dying of diphtheria in Samach's camp," she said without preamble. "I have antitoxin serum, but I need to reach them before the pass closes, and I need a guide who will not lose the trail if the weather turns." Jedediah did not hesitate. "Give me 10 minutes to pack." "Jedediah, the council forbade you from town business, and this could see you exiled from Larkspur Hollow entirely if Crane learns of it." "Let him try to exile me for saving children's lives," Jedediah said, already reaching for his heavy winter coat, his rifle, a coil of rope. "I did not leave this valley to those men's lies before, Violet, and I am not about to start now, whatever it costs me. 10 minutes. They rode out within the hour, racing the light and the gathering clouds, and made good progress for the first several hours, following a trail Jedediah clearly knew by instinct rather than sight, cutting through stands of lodgepole pine gone dark and heavy with the coming storm. But by mid-afternoon of the second day, deep in the high pass with the camp still some hours distant, the sky opened without warning into a blizzard of a violence Violet had never witnessed, snow driving nearly sideways on a wind that screamed through the narrow rock corridor of the pass and stole visibility down to a few feet in every direction. "We need shelter," Jedediah shouted over the howling wind, pulling his horse close to hers, snow already crusting thick in his dark hair and beard. "The children cannot wait out a storm, Jedediah. They will suffocate before we. And you will die of exposure halfway up this mountain if we push on blind, and the serum will freeze solid besides, and then no one is saved at all." His hand closed over her reins, steadying her horse, and his eyes, fierce and urgent in the whipping snow, held hers with an intensity that brooked no argument. "There is a hollow beneath a rock overhang half a mile ahead. I have sheltered there before. We wait out the worst of it, and we move again the moment we can see." Violet, cold and frightened and furious at the mountain's indifference to human urgency, forced herself to trust his judgment, because trust, she understood in that moment, was the only currency that mattered when the world itself had turned against them. The half-mile felt endless, both of them dismounting to lead the horses on foot when the wind grew too fierce to ride safely, Jedediah's enormous frame breaking trail through drifts already knee-deep, his hand never leaving Violet's arm for more than a few seconds at a time, steadying her when she stumbled, guiding her when the world narrowed to nothing but white. When they finally reached the rock overhang, a shallow cave scarcely large enough for 2 people and 2 horses pressed close together, Violet was shaking so hard with cold that her teeth chattered audibly, and Jedediah, working with the swift efficiency of a man who had survived 100 such storms before, built a small fire from dry wood cached beneath the overhang from some previous journey, and pulled her, without ceremony or apology, into the warmth of his own body, wrapping his heavy coat around them both. "You will lose fingers to frostbite if you do not warm through properly," he said, his voice rough, his arms like iron bands around her, and Violet, too cold and too frightened to protest the impropriety of it, simply pressed herself into his warmth and let herself, for the first time in weeks, feel entirely safe. "The serum," she managed through chattering teeth. "It cannot freeze, Jedediah, it will lose all potency." "Where is it?" "Inner pocket of my coat, wrapped in wool." He checked it himself, his large hands surprisingly gentle as they worked at the buttons of her coat to confirm the packet was secure and still insulated against the worst of the cold, and satisfied, he tucked it carefully back into place, close against her body where their combined warmth would protect it. "You put yourself last again," he said quietly, once the fire had built enough to throw real heat into their small shelter. "You checked on the serum before you thought to worry for your own hands." "6 children are dying, Jedediah. My hands can wait." He was quiet for a long moment, studying her face in the firelight, snow still howling beyond their small refuge. "I have known soldiers who would not have shown that kind of courage, Violet, I mean that. I have seen men break under far less than what you have carried calmly for 2 days. I am not calm," she admitted, her voice small in the roaring dark. "I am terrified we will not reach them in time. I am terrified of this storm. I have been terrified since the moment I understood what disease we were dealing with. And yet you came anyway. Because being frightened has never once stopped me from doing what needed doing. My father taught me that a doctor who waits for courage to arrive before acting will lose every patient worth saving. Courage is not the absence of fear, Jedediah. It is acting rightly in spite of it." He looked at her for a long moment, something raw and unguarded moving behind his gray-green eyes, lit gold by the small fire. "I left the cavalry because I stopped believing I could act rightly at all, after everything I had seen and done as a translator for orders I could not stop. I have spent years since then believing the safest thing I could do for anyone was stay alone on this mountain, where my mistakes could not touch other people's lives. His voice roughened further. You have made that belief very difficult to hold on to, Violet Slater. Good, she whispered. I do not think it was ever a belief that served you well. He reached up slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, and brushed a strand of snow-damp hair back from her face with a gentleness that made her breath catch entirely. I love you, he said simply, without preamble or apology, the words offered as plainly and honestly as everything else about him. I think I have known it since the night I watched you throw yourself into a flood for a child you had never met. I did not want to say it while you might have felt obligated to answer out of fear or exhaustion, but I do not know how many more hours this storm intends to give us, and I did not want to spend them in silence, not on this. Violet felt tears rise, hot against the cold air, entirely unrelated to fear or exhaustion. I love you too, Jedediah. I have for weeks, I think, longer than I have let myself admit, because I was afraid of wanting something I thought I had already decided I did not need. She laughed, unsteady and wet. I refused your proposal because it was practical, and I find now that I want nothing practical at all with you. I want it because I choose you freely with my whole heart, storm and all. He kissed her then, slow and certain despite the cold and the howling wind and the desperate uncertainty of the hours still ahead of them. And Violet, warmed at last by something far more enduring than any fire, understood that whatever the mountain still had in store for them, she would face it exactly where she wanted to be. The storm broke 3 hours before dawn, exhausting itself against the mountains as suddenly as it had risen, and Jedediah and Violet pushed on through a world scoured white and silent, the horses laboring through drifts that had swallowed the trail entirely. Jedediah navigated by instinct and memory, by the shape of rock formations half buried in snow, by a scout's trained sense of direction that had, Violet realized with growing awe, kept men alive through far worse than this for 11 years of army service. They reached Chief Samach's camp just past midday, half frozen and utterly spent, to find the camp in genuine crisis. 7 children now showing symptoms, 2 already struggling badly for breath. Violet worked through the remainder of that day and long into the night, administering the antitoxin with careful precision, monitoring each small patient's breathing, boiling water for the compresses and steam treatments that eased the worst of the choking, while Jedediah translated her instructions to anxious parents and helped hold frightened children still for injections, his enormous hands as gentle with them as they had been with Ahiga weeks before. By the second morning, the crisis had turned. The sickest children were breathing easier, fevers beginning to break, and Chief Samach himself, a dignified man of perhaps 50 with deep lines of worry, only now beginning to ease from his face, came to Violet and Jedediah's fire to offer his thanks in words Jedediah translated with evident emotion. He says, Jedediah told her quietly, that he will not forget that a settlement doctor rode through a mountain storm to save children who are not her own people, when others in this valley have called for his people's destruction over a lie. Tell him, Violet said, that I did not ride here to distinguish between whose children needed saving. Only that they needed saving. It was in the warmth of that gratitude, 2 days later, that Samach produced the final piece of evidence they needed. He brought forth, from a carefully guarded storage bundle, a set of knotted cords and painted hide markings, the band's own careful record of the original treaty terms as they had understood them at the signing 3 years before, kept exactly as a check against any future dispute. When Jedediah compared these records, translated slowly and carefully, against the false terms Prout had been feeding to the settlement council, the discrepancy was plain and damning beyond any possibility of denial. Samach further revealed that he had, in fact, kept the very paper Ahiga had described weeks before, the one bearing a red wax seal, having grown suspicious enough of Prout's shifting stories to demand he leave a copy behind as proof of his claims. It named no government authority at all upon careful examination, only Prute's own signature dressed up with an official-looking flourish, exactly the fraud Jedediah had suspected from the start. "This is enough," Violet said, examining the document by firelight. "This alone, alongside Samach's own record and testimony, is enough to unravel everything Prute and Crane have built." They returned to Larkspur Hollow 4 days later, the pass finally clear enough for safe travel, carrying with them not only the proof of fraud but the deepened, unshakable devotion of two people who had faced down a mountain's worst weather together and come through it bound more closely than either had believed possible only weeks before. The confrontation, when it came, was swift and complete. Violet called for an emergency council meeting the very evening of their return, and before Rourke or any other council member could raise an objection to Jedediah's presence, she laid Samach's documents and testimony plainly before them, with Jedediah standing at her side, translating each detail with the calm, exacting precision of a man finally free to speak truth without fear of what it might cost him. Silas Crane, confronted publicly with evidence he could not explain away, made one final attempt at denial, but his composure cracked visibly when Rourke, examining the forged seal himself, recognized it immediately as a crude imitation of the territorial governor's own mark, easily disproven by comparison to genuine documents the council kept on file. Otis Prute, summoned before the assembled council, broke entirely under the weight of the evidence and confessed within minutes, naming Crane's syndicate explicitly as the source of his payment and instruction, in a desperate bid to shift blame away from himself. Crane was escorted out of Larkspur Hollow before nightfall, under armed guard from among the very ranchers he had hoped to turn against Samach's band, with clear warning never to return to the territory on pain of formal charges. Prute, stripped of his position and his credibility both, left by the morning stage, his usefulness to any syndicate now permanently ruined by his own confession. Rourke, standing before the assembled town the following day, offered Jedediah a public apology that seemed to cost the heavyset mayor a great deal of pride to deliver, and offered Violet, in the same breath, the council's full and unqualified support for her practice, whatever her personal arrangements might eventually become. "I believe, Dr. Slater," he said, with the ghost of a rueful smile, "that this town owes you and Mr. Morgan both a debt it will take considerable time to properly repay." "Then let it begin," Violet said, "with a genuine peace council between this settlement and Chief Samach's band, properly translated this time, with terms both sides can trust." That council convened 2 weeks later, in the first true cold of winter, and Jedediah Morgan stood at its center as the trusted translator, both settlement and band now turned to without hesitation, his 11 years of guilt over words twisted into violence finally, fully redeemed by words carefully and honestly rendered into peace instead. The original treaty was reaffirmed with new clarity, water rights along Copper Creek properly documented in both languages this time, with copies held by Samach's band, the Settlement Council, and at Violet's quiet insistence, by Violet herself, that no future interpreter might ever again hold sole power over so fragile a peace. It was on a clear, cold evening in late December, with the first true snow of winter settled soft and silent over Larkspur Hollow, that Jedediah Morgan came to Violet's office one final time to ask a question he had asked once before, though everything about the asking had changed entirely. He did not arrive with a practical argument this time, no talk of reputation or council objections. He arrived with a small ring, hammered from a piece of silver he had clearly worked himself with careful, unpracticed hands, and an expression of open, unguarded hope that Violet had never before seen on his face. "I am not asking this time to solve a problem," he said, his voice rough with feeling. "I am asking because I cannot imagine building the rest of my life anywhere that you are not beside me, Violet Slater. I love you. Not out of duty, not out of convenience, but because you are the bravest, most stubborn, most extraordinary woman I have ever known, and I would consider it the greatest honor of my life if you would agree to be my wife." Violet took the ring from his hand, turning it in the lamplight, feeling the weight of everything they had survived together settle into this single, perfect moment. "Yes," she said, laughing through sudden tears. "Yes, Jedediah, I choose you, freely and completely and forever if you will have me." They were married in the small, repaired church 3 weeks later, in a ceremony attended by nearly the entire town, alongside Ahiga and several others from Samach's band who had traveled down through the snow to witness the union of two people whose courage had, in different ways, saved them all. Chief Samach himself offered a blessing in his own language, which Jedediah, standing at the altar with Violet's hand clasped tightly in his own, translated softly for her alone, his voice thick with an emotion that needed no further words. They built their life together in the months that followed, in a home raised on the edge of town near enough for Violet's growing practice to serve everyone who needed her, and near enough to the tree line that Jedediah could still walk into the mountains he loved whenever the wild silence called to him, always returning by evening to the fire, and the woman that had become his true home. Violet expanded Dr. Reed's old office into a proper clinic, training 2 local women as nurses to help meet the valley's needs, and Jedediah, no longer a man hiding from his own past, became the settlement's trusted bridge to Samach's people, his scout's knowledge finally put toward building peace instead of merely surviving war. On a quiet evening the following spring, with the windows open to air gone soft and green after the long winter, Violet sat at her writing desk and took up her pen to compose a letter to her mentor in Cheyenne, Dr. Josiah Hale, the same man whose careful copperplate had once addressed an introduction to a physician long dead before she ever arrived to deliver it. This letter she wrote herself in her own hand, and it carried no sorrow for a stranger's grave, but news of a thriving clinic, a valley's hard-won peace, and a marriage built not on convenience but on the freely chosen love of a mountain man who had given her, in the truest sense, an entirely new reason to write. She sealed it carefully, set it aside for the morning post, and crossed the small, warm room to where Jedediah sat mending a length of harness by lamplight, his sleeves rolled to reveal forearms she had long since stopped cataloging merely for their strength, and had come instead to love simply because they were his. He looked up at her approach, gray-green eyes soft in the lamplight, and drew her down beside him without a word, and Violet Slater, who had once ridden into Larkspur Hollow carrying a letter meant for a man long gone, settled into the circle of Jedediah Morgan's arms and understood, with the same quiet certainty she brought to every difficult diagnosis, that she had finally, truly arrived exactly where she belonged.